sparkly beans! If you're new here, my name is Avery and I help folks who are passionate about liberation and justice to find themselves and their roles in an emerging future. One of the ways I do that is using astrology, and we are here, Practical Astrology 101, for another video on one of the foundational concepts of astrology, and that is aspects. So aspects are a big topic. And I'm really going to try in this video to narrow it down and keep it on the very basics so that you can basically take a look at your birth chart, be able to see what aspects are present, and have a basic understanding of what they mean. I will be doing at least one more video on aspects in this series. After we talk about planetary motion, we'll talk about transiting aspects, or how planets make aspects as they're moving from the sky, but for this video we're just focusing on in your birth chart. There are a lot of ways aspects can come up, because when we say aspect in astrology, one thing that can be kind of confusing is that in general terms, right, you might just say an aspect is something like a trait or a characteristic, but in astrology it specifically means the angles between points and planets in the chart. So we're looking at sort of how different planets or points are in conversation with each other. We've so far covered our planets, our houses, our signs, and so you have a pretty good vocabulary if you've been through the series, and if you haven't already, you can check the link above for the playlist and start from the top. But if you have done that, then you already have a vocabulary to talk about some of the planets and points in your chart to describe what they're doing and how they do it with the sign and where that is occurring in your life with the house. Aspects are adding the ability to look at how each of these individual points talk to one another. And so if you've ever heard an astrologer say the kind of tried and true thing of, well, you have to look at the whole chart when talking about a placement. This is part of that, because you may have a planet or a point that is behaving in a certain way, but because of the way that it's related to a different one, it gives it a different flavor, it adds something to it. And so when you hear the word aspect, you can just in your head think angle, relationship, between one or more things. We're not, like I said, we're not going to cover transiting aspects today, but just briefly I'll say that like some of the places the aspects do come up. Of course, as the planets are moving through the sky, the angles that they form to other planets shift and vary. So if we say a transiting aspect, you know, we can have, let's say, to keep it simple, two planets. We can have two planets that at some point in time are going to be at that angle to one another. And so that's the transiting aspect where, you know, everyone will experience to some extent that relationship between those planets at that time. You can also have the planets as they move transiting your chart, or transiting, we'd say transiting your natal planets. So that would mean that an angle forms between where a particular planet is in the sky right now and where a particular planet, the same or a different one, is in your birth chart. You also can talk about aspects between multiple charts. So, you know, in your chart at the snapshot time when you were born, different planets may have been at different angles to one another. You can also take two charts, say your chart and a partner's chart, your chart and a friend's chart, your chart and your mom's chart, whatever. You can look at your chart to your business's chart or to your country's chart, right? There's infinite combinations. And you can look at the angles between the two charts. So you can say, if this is at this point and this is at this point, what would the angle be between them, right? That's pretty advanced. We're not going to go there. You know, you can also look at this with other techniques like secondary progressions. Again, not going to go there, since this is a fundamentals kind of video, but just to give you a sense of how they come up pretty much everywhere. So when you're looking at aspects, like I said, they are angles. And so, you know, you got a chart is round, right? And we're going to be looking at the degree of where the planet is in a sign. So I think we kind of glossed over this before, but if you take a look at your chart, again, you can pull that up on astro.com, or there's a number of other websites if you have a favorite. Pull up your chart, and if you take a look, you will notice that there's going to be a number next to, we'll just say planets for now, right? Each of the planets in your chart. So you might see, as an example, my sun, it's in Pisces, and next to it has two little numbers. It says 12, and then I can't remember the second number. But the first number is the degree, the second number is the minute. So each sign is going to have, it goes from 0 to 29, so it's a total of 30 degrees. And that's actual degrees, right, in a circle. So if a circle's 360, each is 30, yeah? So you're going to see, you know, my sun, for example, is at 12, so it's close to midway through the sign of Pisces. And then the second number is just a little more specific. It's called an arc minute, and it's there's 60 of them. Don't worry about the second number. For now, we're just going to mostly pay attention to the first number. So once you know that number, you can look for other planets that have the same number. And most, not technically all, but pretty much most aspects, and all the ones we're going to be discussing in this video, are going to have the same number. Okay? So that's the starting point, is just looking for same number. Now there's a little tolerance here. So it's not literally the same number. It's within a few degrees. And this is something that varies from astrologer to astrologer. It's called an orb. An orb is basically, what is your tolerance for how close is it to forming the angle that we just call it real. Call it real, but so it's called exact when it's right at the same spot. So if it's 12 degrees and we have another planet at 12 degrees, that's an exact aspect. That's going to be really strong. That's going to be the point in the sky. You know, if you have that, you were born at the point where those planets were right at that angle. Technically, I guess you would look at degree and minute, right? So if it was 12, 12, and 12, 12, but generally we tend to say it's the same degree. It's basically, that's going to be your exact point. So one way you might relate this to things that you've heard of before, if you think about moon phases, and we'll have a video about that, but moon phases are about the relationship between the sun and the moon, which is represented by an angle. So when you, for example, have a full moon, you're looking at the sun and the moon being opposed to one another. They're on opposite sides of the chart. And the way that we say, like, the full moon is happening at X time in your location is the point at which the sun and the moon have the exact same degree and minute. But you're going to feel that full moon energy, around that time. And so that's the orb. The orb is the around that time. So it's going to vary. Different astrologers have different numbers they use for orbs. And it also is going to vary by the planets. So you tend to use different orbs based on the speed of the planets. I don't think it's that crucial to go into, especially if you are a beginner. I find that just whatever your software decides is an angle is probably a good enough starting point. You could also just say, I'm just going to look at real tight ones, so I'll just look at anything within 3 degrees on either side. That's often what I do, even though that's a not very precise way of doing it. Because it does vary based on how fast they move. But generally speaking, you're looking for something around that degree. So your software is very likely, definitely Astro.com does this, going to show you a bunch of little colored lines. So you may have wondered, if you pulled through your chart, like, why are there all these colored lines in the middle? If you're using Astro.com, you also get a little table at the bottom that will it's a grid where it will show you all the planets and then all the planets again, and so that you can cross-reference and say, okay, sun, moon, and then it'll have the little symbol for which aspect it is. So you can actually see, and depending on your settings in astro.com, you can see the orb. It will say like a square. The icon for a square is a square. So it'll be like square 3, and that's just saying that it's within 3 degrees. So, and you can tinker with those settings in astro.com and a lot of other, depending on like how sophisticated the site is, you may be able to tinker with that and say, oh, I want it to only show if the orb is within 3 or 5 or whatever. Again, the details of that are kind of beyond the scope, but for now, let's just say we're looking at things that are relatively close to being the same number. Or if you don't want to worry about the numbers, you can just look at those little lines. The lines sometimes get really confusing because if there's a lot of lines, right? Depending on how many points and planets you're showing on the chart, you may not be able to even see them clearly. But you can use, if you're using astro.com, that little table can be really handy. So you can just do a quick like cross-reference. Okay, great. These are the planets that are, according to the default settings, these are the planets that are aspecting one another. So that's the basic idea in terms of how to find them. And you can also use, as you go, you start to be able to kind of eyeball it. And we'll talk about what each of the particular aspects are. It's not I should say that there are a lot of aspects for pretty much, I guess for any possible sign. If you've got 12 here, if you got 12 anywhere else, there is an aspect to describe that. But we're going to, in particular, talk about some of the more common aspects, the like classical aspects today, just to keep it a little simpler. If you're interested in the others, if you notice, for example, that you have, 2 planets at the same degree that are 1 sign apart, we're not going to talk about that today, but you can look that up. We are going to look at, like I said, those classical aspects, and then we're going to go one at a time. So we're going to look at like what happens when you have 2 planets at an angle. There are larger aspect patterns, and I'll just mention that briefly to say that if you notice things like, for example, I have a planet that is, one of the more common ones is called a T-square. So like if you have 2 planets that are exactly opposite, and then you have 1 planet forming a square, we'll talk about it, but it's a 90-degree angle, that's called a T-square. And you can look up, there's really interesting stuff about aspect patterns, and I may do a video on that at some point, but that would be if you notice that there are, the aspects we discuss are hitting more than 1 planet. Another example would be a grand trine, where you have a trine here to here to here. There's 3 planets and they're forming a triangle. That's a specific concept that you can look up and learn about that aspect pattern, but we're just going to talk about aspects. Okay, so as always, there's a lot of front content, but now we're going to start talking one by one. I think that's all the basic stuff. I will say that as we go, so yeah, we're going to go one at a time. If you're looking at your chart while you're watching this, my recommendation would be looking at and considering both what you've already learned in this series about the nature of the planets, where they are individually, and then I would look one by one. I wouldn't try to do the pattern. So I would just say, okay, great. If my sun, let's say, is squaring my moon, what do I know about my sun? What do I know about my moon? And then today we'll talk about what the square is and what might that bring up for me in my birth chart. So I would recommend that kind of one by one approach when you're starting out, to just look at each individual aspect in your chart, and not worry too much about trying to understand the big picture or like prioritize. If you're going to prioritize it all, you could start by, if you're seeing lots of aspects and you're like, I don't even know what to look at first, you might look at the ones that have the tighter orb. So if you see they're close to exact, if you see 2 that have the same number, or it's just 1 number apart, say 12 and 13, that's typically going to be a little stronger in energy than, say, 12 and 16, which, depending on the planets, we probably will still think of as that aspect, but it's a little weaker because they're not quite on the angle, if that makes sense. And some folks like to pay more attention to the kind of more challenging aspects, just because often there's kind of more to do with that, more to like consider in terms of what can you do to resolve or to work with that tension. And I sort of subscribe to that, but I don't know, either way. So if you want to, you can do that, but again, you could also just go like 1, 2, 3, just go down you could look at the little grid and just each one you see, go ahead and take a look at that. You will notice that the lines, and as well as the symbols in that grid, are typically going to be 3 different colors. It depends on the software. I'm going to give you the astro.com colors. They're pretty common. There are some differences in different software. But typically what you're going to see is you're going to see red for the more challenging aspects. You're going to see blue for the more supportive aspects, and then green for the other ones. And green, I guess green is typically for like the minor aspects. It's not necessarily the other ones, but for the more minor aspects. You might wonder, okay, so they're good and they're bad aspects. Well, this is an area where I really like to challenge, destabilize, decentralize, and invite your own interpretation, because the challenging aspects they do represent a tension in your chart. They represent something to kind of resolve or work with. Although it's interesting because a conjunction is considered a challenging aspect, and sometimes you'll read that it's a challenge. It's always read, but sometimes you'll read that it's a challenging aspect. Sometimes people will say, well, it depends on what the conjunction is. So again, like it's not even that straightforward. But typically, a challenging aspect, especially the square and the opposition, are going to be something that that may present problems, pressure, tension, words like that. And then the supportive aspects, the ones that are represented in blue, we're going to be talking today about the trine and the sextile. These are supportive. The energy tends to flow more sort of easily between the planets involved. Tends to be, you can say, some people will say, a more flowing aspect. And yet, things flowing easily doesn't necessarily represent growth or progress. And so that's why I wouldn't think of them as good and bad aspects. I would think of them as sort of, you can imagine even like the laws of physics, right? Like the way that when there is friction, when there is tension, when there is, when things kind of come to a head, those might be the things that you tend to notice and that tend to be big or more dramatic, but they're also catalyst points for change. And then easy flow and supportive flow can be really helpful, especially to balance, right, those more tense aspects. Which doesn't necessarily mean good. It could mean, in fact, I noticed in my own chart that sometimes one of my supportive aspects, it's almost like the energy coming from one planet is so strong and it easily flows to the other planet, and maybe I wouldn't always want that. So that's just an example of how those can operate differently. I'll also say that if you know a little bit about aspects and you're wondering about this, there's also a concept of separating and applying aspects, which has to do with which planet comes first, which order they're in. We'll talk about that briefly in the later video on the transiting aspects. It does, you can see in the birth chart whether it's separating or applying aspect, but I'm not going to cover that here. So just so you know, that is coming. All right, let's talk about them. What are the aspects? So we're going to be talking about 5 aspects today. We've got our, and I'm gonna call the conjunction its own thing. So we're gonna do our supportive aspects, our challenging aspects, and then I'll talk about the conjunction, which is kind of an either or, depends. And we'll start with the supportive aspects. They're about easy flow. And so there's honestly like not a ton that I'm going to say about them other than, yeah, it's easy flow. So the 2 aspects that we're talking about here would be the trine and the sextile. A trine occurs I'm going to give you some tips as we go on like how to spot these really quickly in your own chart or others' charts. So a trine is, it comes from triangle, right? And I mentioned like a grand trine, it forms a triangle. Well, the angle that we're talking about here is between, and I'm so bad at angles, I have to do the, like in my head, it's like 91 to 120, it's 120 degrees separates them. Again, it's an orb, so 121, 123, 124, that's all gonna count. But more or less, it's a 120 degree angle. Here's how you spot a trine really easily. Trines are always the same sign. So we talked about the order of the signs, and we talked about elements and modalities. Did I say same sign? I meant same element if I said same sign. They're always the same element. So we know that when you count, you're going to hit the same element because there's 4 elements. You're always going to hit it on the 5th go. So if you see something at some degree of Scorpio and you want to know if there's a trine there, quickly look to Pisces and Cancer at the same degree or similar. Same with Earth, same with fire, same with air. So that's a trine. And then a sextile is going to be 60 degrees, so it's 2 signs apart. A sextile doesn't have like a super easy, there's kind of one, but like not a super easy way to spot a sextile, but it's pretty easy to count too. So you're just looking for like it skipped one. If it's 2 apart, there's 1 sign in between, that's a sextile. So with a trine or a sextile, it's really just about supportive flowing energy. The trine is going to be a little stronger, a little more support, particularly supportive. The sextile is a little less. Maybe that's reductionist, but that's how I think of it. Just, starting out the simplest way to think of it. When you have a trine or a sextile, then how can you use this? How is this useful? Well, you're going to notice how energy is going to flow easily between the planets. And again, it kind of depends on how is that planet doing where it is, right? Is it in a sign where it's really comfortable? Is it in a sign where it's less comfortable? We haven't talked so much yet about where they're comfortable or not comfortable, but you can kind of get a sense based on the basic nature of what we've talked about each. So if we think about, like Mars, for example, being a planet of drive and fire and energy, like maybe Mars is not going to be as comfortable in a kind of soft and flowy, like a Mars in Pisces, right? May not be as comfortable in energy. And so if you have planets that may on their own kind of be challenging the place, sometimes having a trine or a sextile can support them. It can help energy flow, especially if it's with a better situated planet. You're going to get that support. And in Hellenistic astrology, in that traditional Western astrological practice, you're going to get a lot of sort of more detailed like comparison and evaluation of like, this is strong, this is not strong, this, energy goes with this energy. There's all sorts of concepts that we don't have time to go into right in this video about the way that aspects work and kind of what it means for that energy to flow around, but that's the basic idea. So if you're working with something and you're like, oh, this area of my life is really challenging, maybe it's you have trouble with communication and expressing yourself. Well, you could look to Mercury and you could say, okay, well, I know that like my Mercury placement is at least part of where I'm going to find that theme. What is it connected to? And if there's a supportive aspect, sextile or trine to Mercury, you might be able to work with the energy of that connecting planet. An example from my own chart, I have a very tight exact trine between my sun sign and my rising sign. I also have a very close trine between my sun and my moon. And so we talked about, I may have even mentioned this in the video, like we talked about sun, moon, and rising as kind of our big 3. So having that very flowing, natural, supportive energy between my sun over here and my moon and rising, I experience that as supportive in the sense that it's like, you know, who I am on the inside and who I am present myself to the world, and my kind of fundamental needs and my purpose or my identity, my role, all of these things flow really naturally together. So I don't have a lot of tension there. That would just be an example of how that shows up. So let's look at the challenging aspects. And the challenging aspects, I think, can often be like, oh wow, light bulb moment, right? So we've got the square, we've got the opposition. So the square is going to be a 90-degree angle, I mentioned before, and the opposition is opposite. It's 180 degrees. It's the opposite side of the chart. So you can spot these by, well, opposition is pretty easy to see, right? And then if you're looking for what is the square, excuse me, then you're going to be looking at signs that are in the same modality. So fixed, cardinal, or mutable. So we talked about that. You can go back if you need a refresher. But if you have something in a cardinal sign, then the sign opposite is going to be cardinal, and then the two signs at 90 degrees are going to be cardinal. So if you have these two are a little different. So if you have a square, I like to think, so square is like it kind of tends to force action. It's a relationship between planets where the energies of those two signs, again, they're the same modality, but they're different elements. So they have a different way of going about things. It tends to be like a clash, like a, something's got to give kind of energy. You could think of, just like a collision. So if it's, sometimes squares might be experienced as like really like boom, explosive energy. When we're looking at the natal chart, of course, it's the chart that references your entire life. So, it's not just one point. And we'll talk in transiting charts about how a transiting square might really be like an explosive energy. When you're looking at your natal chart, you may find that the energies of those two planets that are squaring each other just tend to be kind of a tension point or a conflict that forces creative resolution, forces creative action. You can kind of think of the phrase like pressure makes diamonds, right? The tension between those 2 points might have to generate something. So an example from my own chart, again, we talked about, I mentioned that my moon and my sun are trine. Well, my moon and my Mars, also my moon and my Venus, but I'll give Mars as an example. Moon and my Mars are square. And so I have Cancer moon, I have a Mars and Aries. And I bring up this example as one where, again, I haven't covered this, but it so happens that the moon is kind of at home in Cancer. Mars is kind of at home in Aries. So they're both really strong of what they are, right? A Cancer moon is very lunar. A Mars in Aries is very martial. So I have this, on the one hand, Cancer moon tendency to be like, I'm very sensitive, like, emotional safety is really fundamentally important to me, especially because it's right by my rising. My like day to day, that safety is really important to me. And also like I can be kind of like emotionally sensitive and volatile, like if poked, basically. I'm most comfortable around people that I really have that trust and safety with. That's usually a small circle. So those are some of the things that might come up with the Cancer moon. And then with Mars and Aries, it's like fiery, it's impulsive, it's do it quickly. We talked about cardinal signs, right? Want to like start something. Mars and Aries really wants to start something. So it's, boom, it's that spark. And absolutely, I notice this square energy in my own life, my own personality, because I have this drive to want to just do it, just like try it, just jump forward. And then I also have this desire for emotional safety, and those two things don't necessarily go well together. And so it may be that, sometimes when I do make that big jump or make that leap or try something or start something, that it also is a flood of tears. Or, you know, it may be, yeah, I find that for me, usually the Mars is poking the moon rather than the moon poking the Mars, but that's also true, like having Venus as well in Aries, that sometimes it's like wanting to make that connection. So where I mentioned that Cancer moon, right, like once they're close people, but a Venus in Aries might kind of be like, I want the new shiny person, right? And I tend to have a lot of like new relationship energy where it's like, hey, person, and then it's like, okay, I'm gonna, it doesn't necessarily naturally support having those close people. However, having that tension in my chart gives me something really to work with, right? And so I've had to work with like, what are my cycles, my rhythms, my energy? Like, I know that my energy with Mars and Aries is very up and down. It's like, it's go, but then it can't maintain it. And I know that my Cancer moon really needs rest. And so like some of the creative ways I've worked with this is that wherever possible, finding ways to kind of make peace with my schedule being like this, and to see where I can get support for that. And as an example of how you could start to put these things together, with that trine from moon to sun, one of the places I can get support with that is that my identity, my purpose, my kind of role in life, my sun is in a watery sign of Pisces that is comfortable with my moon. And so in some ways I've been able to, through my work and through what I do and through how I show up, being very watery, that allows me to have a kind of inconsistent schedule and it doesn't surprise anyone, right? So that's just like one way to work with it. And I will do, I hope at the end of this series actually to do some other example charts. So I'll show you others other than my own, but for now I'm just gonna give you mine. Examples for my own. So you can look for points where it's squaring as places where you might think creatively, like, what is that? Like, how do those two things conflict in my life? How do those two things sometimes war with each other? And is there a way that I can almost find a third path? Is there a way to resolve that tension? So then we'll look at the opposition. So, and we talked a little bit, I'm gonna go into this maybe slightly less, just because I think we actually did talk about this some when we were talking about the signs, when we're talking about the houses, the way you have polarities across the chart from each other. So you have this like push-pull, with opposition, I think of a tug of war, right? Of a, like, we're both trying to pull on the rope, but ultimately, if one of us pulls too hard, the other one falls in the dirt. We don't want part of ourself to fall into the dirt if the planet represents that. And so if our goal is to keep both of those aspects of self represented by those planets from falling in the dirt, then either they both have to be pulling in a similar way, or they drop the rope and make friends. So it's not quite it, but like, I find that one of the best ways to work with oppositions and this kind of tug energy is to, again, it's sort of similar to a square. It doesn't feel, I don't find that it feels as explosive really, but there is, again, a creativity to working with the opposition. And with the opposition, I think it's less about like the two hit and then they have to find a third direction. It's more, in my experience, of you're blending the two, you're alchemizing the two, you're finding the integration of the two. So an example of an opposition, I actually don't have many oppositions in my chart, so let me just do a made-up one. So let's say you have, we just talked about cardinal signs, so let's do an opposition between two fixed. So let's say you have, let's do Taurus Scorpio, because right now the eclipses have been in Taurus and Scorpio. So you may have been experiencing some sort of Taurus Scorpio action. So if you have, we'll do Venus and Taurus opposed, I don't know, Mercury and Scorpio, as an example. So Venus and Taurus. So again, you look to the two. They're sort of essential natures. So if you look at a Venus and Taurus, I'm not going to bother with the house right now, so we'll just not say what house it is. But let's say it's Venus and Taurus. Then you're going to have, that's a very kind of like sensual energy. That's a, you know, it's fixed Earth and it's a Venus. So it's like you've got the Venusian themes of like art and beauty and relation. We talked about how Venus is also has like an attraction principle. It's what like magnetizes and draws. So in Taurus, you're going to expect that that Venus is going to be really looking for like to draw things to them that are lasting. It's a fixed sign, that are sustainable, that are material. I mean, I don't think it's as simple as Venus and Taurus wants to like marry wealthy or something, because I think a lot of astrology books would say that, and I find that very reductionist. But you know, it's I do though think of Venus and Taurus is going to tend to want to bring things into their life that are nurturing and sustaining and grounding and feel natural and feel comfortable. Okay, and then if we look at the opposite and we say, okay, now we've got Mercury over here in Scorpio. Well, Scorpio is also a fixed sign, but it's fixed water. And with Mercury in Scorpio, it's like that is going to be, that's, you know, Mercury, mental processes, information, and communication, is going to tend to want to dig really deep, right? Scorpio, often we think of like a well or a lake or a fixed body of water going really deep, emotionally, water sign, going like really, Scorpio can almost sometimes have a little bit of like an obsessive quality, but also just like like a passion to dig in and like not be uncomfortable with the darker things in life. But if you just look at the fixed water, you can also just think of that, you know, wanting to sustain and keep an emotional security. It sometimes requires going really deep to be like, yeah, you're my person, we got this. And so if you imagine the push-pull between those, it's not that they're opposites. In fact, you can probably already hear or see or think of some ways in which those energies could complement each other. But maybe you have this, you know, desire for things to be physically comfortable, materially comfortable. That might be in tension with the desire to dig really deep emotionally. Because sometimes when you dig really deep emotionally, you know, you may lose the material security or comfort. So like an example of where it might come up in a life, because again, this is talking about the natal chart, we're talking about the whole life, but like, you know, a common scenario that might occur for this person is that you could end up, actually, I just thought of a really funny example. So I was going to say, so the obvious thing that came to me was like, you could be in a situation where like you have a really stable relationship with someone that is financially stable, that is like the status quo of like maybe where you live together, the just material day to day feels very grounded and like it's not going to get messed up. But then you have the tension with this, you know, maybe you hear some little detail that threatens your emotional security and you're like, oh shit. And now the Mercury wants to like dig and wants to know as much as possible, and wants to understand the emotional truth of that person, but that could maybe upset the material security. So that might be an example of that. Or other way around, right? The material security could keep you from wanting to dig real deep. The thing that made me laugh was that my brain was like, I was thinking of the like artistic nature of Venus and how it could be like the like sensual beauty of something, you know, a piece of art or something that you're drawn to, that you love, that you've kept in your home, and then you learn Mercury in Scorpio, digging and realizing that there's something really problematic about it, that maybe, you know, there's some like traumatic story of that art, or maybe there's a really problematic like artist, and then you're like, well, I really like my art, but I don't know. That could be another example of that. So again, push pull, how can you integrate the two? So like, how can you, you know, in this case, like how with the, let's say the relationship example, right? How can you alchemize and say, well, what if they actually have things in common, because the polarities always have something in common. They've got that fixed energy. And so, you know, if you have the desire for to go really emotionally deep, to really understand another person, and you have this desire to be physically comfortable, to have a, like, maintain a relationship for a while, to sustain, well, those aren't necessarily incompatible. How do you incorporate the emotional element into the material element? And maybe also the reverse, you know, how do you, maybe it's like setting up expectations, or maybe it's hard without like a specific story of a person, right? Because I'm not giving a relationship advice right now, but you could have some, I can imagine a situation, right, where you know, talking about your priorities and your desire to maintain the relationship creates a grounded and earthy container for that emotional digging. And if you both understand that the emotional digging is meant to support the sustainability of the relationship long term, well, that could be a really good blend. And of course, with the relationship example, we're talking about another person, and you could look at the angles to their chart. That could be a whole nother story. But just starting from the basics, you might think about with your oppositions, you know, how would those blend? What combined energy might come? If it's a little tough to do like that full example of looking at the planet, looking where it is, looking at everything, you could start from the natural polarity between the signs. And before you even think about what planet, you could just think about Taurus and Scorpio. And what would like a blend of Taurus and Scorpio be? And you might actually think about a lake, right? Like an ecosystem. Like Taurus makes me think of like a really supported, sustained ecosystem that's holding this deep body of water, right? And so I love doing natural metaphors in this way. You know, thinking about the relationship between the two can be really like a creative exercise. If you're a creative person and you enjoy that kind of thing, definitely like think about the nature of like a fixed water and a fixed earth, or maybe it's a cardinal fire and a cardinal air, or whatever it is, and how could they alchemize and blend? And then you can pull in the planets and say, okay, so for me, like this is the part of me that has that, and this is the part of me that has that, and they go together. And again, with all of these, you can also look at the houses, and so you can also look at, you know, oh, is there tension between let's say you have an opposition between the first and the seventh, you know, it's self and other, and looking at how do I, instead of prioritizing just me or prioritizing just them, how do I blend? And again, an astrologer can absolutely help you to do this. I'm actually in the process of changing up some of my offerings, and so if you are looking for an astrology reading, totally reach out. You can find below. I'll include a link to my website, so you can book. If you want a astrology reading, it's in June. If you're watching this soon after I'm posting it in June of 2022, then it's called a Neptune session. If you click that link and it's something totally different, there'll be information. But always feel free to reach out, and I have a free 30-minute consult below. And so if you just want to be like, here's what I'm looking for help with, can you help me? Then I'm absolutely happy to not only do a session with you, but also recommend a good astrologer for whatever you're looking for. So putting the pieces together on your own is a little challenging. Check out my links below, and we'll get you directed to the right place. Because yeah, it really is a puzzle, and I think that's actually a lot of the beauty, and also a lot of the work that goes into being an astrologer, is understanding all these bits and then how they fit together in a great big puzzle. Okay, so last one we're going to talk about today is the conjunction. So I mentioned the conjunction is kind of like, is it supportive? Is it challenging? Well, because the thing about a conjunction is that it's actually just a blend of two, because the conjunction happens when you have two planets that are in the same sign and either in the same degree or very close to it. So they're basically right on top of each other. And what tends to happen there is that their energies blend, they meld, and they can intensify as well. And it depends on what the planets are. And this is where we go into, again, like Hellenistic astrology is going to be very specific and technical about this. Modern astrologers might be a little less so, of saying like, oh, this planet always trumps this planet if it's in this sign. But you can intuitively see a little bit of it. Again, just thinking about the nature of the planets and the signs they're in, you know, if there's a planet that's really comfortable, just intuitively, you're like, oh yeah, the nature of the moon, right? It makes sense that it would be, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if it makes sense to you, like the moon would be pretty happy in Cancer, pretty happy in water signs, you know. And then if you like throw Mars in there, for example, you know, a moon-Mars conjunction, in a water sign might tend to have some sort of moon dominance. In a fire sign might tend to have some more Mars dominance. But there's a lot of details to how that's evaluated. So really, I would just look at any planets you have that are kind of right on top of each other or very close. Think about how those energies might blend. Think about, you know, consider the sign, consider the house, and think about in your life, do the planets themselves tend to blend? And then if you think about that specific area of life and you think about that specific sign energy, where do you see it? By the way, I'm not going to talk about aspect patterns, but I will briefly mention that one thing you may see is called a stellium. If you have a bunch of planets that are right next to each other, or just in a row all in the same sign, it's called a stellium. I don't have any in my own chart, and not everyone does, but I may do a video on that. Let me know below if you want one. I may do a video on that, but you can also look up, there's tons of resources on a stellium. That's just going to be more and more, right? It's like really like intense energy in that sign. But for now, we'll just talk about a plain vanilla conjunction, two planets very close, and what that blend might look like. So I'm going to come back to my own chart. Like 3 or 4 examples are from my chart, sorry. But if, you know, because we already talked about it, I mentioned that I was like, oh yeah, my moon squares my Mars, but also my Venus. That's because my Mars and Venus they're like real close. Like they're 1 degree, and they're like actually less than a degree if you look at the minutes, second bit of the number. So with the conjunction, the two will meld, the two will blend. And so with Mars and Venus in Aries, I have you know, actually it's really hard to talk about that one without talking about the kind of predominance of Mars in Aries. So without explaining it too much, I'll just say that Mars is real strong in Aries, and Venus, not so much. It's not a good place for Venus. And so I experience that often as a kind of overwhelming of Venus. So you have something, again, we'll maybe go into it in a later video, but if you notice, if you look at two together and you're like, wow, I really don't relate to one of these two. Like, so if you're me, I might say, oh, Venus and Aries, what? It might be because the other one is smushing on it a little bit. It also may be that if you know, depending on what the planet is and what its role, like it may just have a stronger influence. Let's talk about a more neutral example, actually. Let's do, oh, I don't know. How about, what have we not done so far? I've been focusing on personal planets as well, like the inner planets. Mars, Venus, Mercury, Sun, Moon, just because of the really like personal effect of those. But let's try doing a combo, actually, of like a personal and a outer. So let's say you have a conjunction between Jupiter and I'm thinking through the examples we've already done. We've already done all the personal planets, haven't we? Yeah, okay, so let's just do Jupiter and, oh, we could do an angle? No, we're gonna do Jupiter and, why is my brain like really just deciding that there's some significance to which one I picked? There really isn't. Let's say the sun. Let's say the sun. We got it, the sun. It's Jupiter and the sun. Let's do Jupiter and the sun in, what's the sign we haven't talked about today? One that isn't particularly strong for either necessarily. Let's do Aquarius. So let's say you have Jupiter and the Sun conjunct in Aquarius. They're right up next to each other. Okay, so let's first just think about the Sun and Jupiter. So if you meld those two, the Sun, you've got your, key kind of identity, your purpose, your kind of role in life, your visible self. There's also just, I like thinking metaphorically, right? It's also like visibility, shining, the sun shines. And then you've also got Jupiter, which is another kind of big energy, right? Because even though it's an outer planet, like it's the big one. And Jupiter, because of that, some of its significations, expanding, growing, intensifying, right? Sometimes excess, sometimes just abundance, right? And so they're going to act on each other in that sense that, your personality, your identity, your purpose may be kind of outsized. It may be like blown up a little bit by Jupiter. You could think of it the other way as well, where that sense of abundance and sense of growth kind of has a light shown on it, and it's an important part of your identity and personality. Now, if we look at where it is, it's in Aquarius. Okay, well then that tells you a little bit about the flavor of that. So, an Aquarian is going to have this like future orientation, is going to have this, this almost like they have the ideas that seem weird and ahead of their time. And there's this like Aquarius paradox of kind of always feeling like an outsider and feeling separate, but they're doing like what they're thinking about, their futurism is for humanity. And so if you imagine that, you could see that it's like that sense of the outsider, that outsider identity could be kind of outsized and could be expanded by Jupiter in such a way that and it could be good or bad, right? Because that, like that example, it's not that one of them is necessarily stronger. Like Jupiter is generally seen as a benefic planet in Hellenistic astrology, but still you can imagine how, in some cases that could be challenging. That could be this sense of like, I'm an outsider and I'm a rebel, and that might progress forward motion, but that also might challenge your sense of belonging. If you, on the other hand, you could also think about how like the abundance of Jupiter in an Aquarian sense, a sense of like belief and possibility in the future could come up there. And if that's a big part of your identity, that could be quite beautiful. So you can kind of see like the way they meld, it might vary. I'll come back to my own example of the Mars, Venus, and Aries thing. Even though, like, yeah, there's a little bit of a smushing of like Mars and Aries is very Mars, and so it's basically like making my Venus more Mars is one way you could think of it. And in that case, it is a little bit like it doesn't have a like bi-directional feel so much as a little bit of a heavier feel. And again, we will talk about separating and applying aspects, and that will influence this as well. But in another video. But for now, I'll just say that like one of the ways in which that kind of blends for me is that the way I pull things into my life, the way I experience joy and pleasure and beauty and relationship, has a kind of fire behind it and a kind of fleeting nature of it. And so with those things blended, it'll be like, momentary joys can be really accessible to me of like, oh, I want that, right? That can also be like impulse eating. So, there's different ways in which the energies show up. Mars is also associated with like sex and sexuality. And sometimes I think of and Aries being this like individual kind of burst or this like personal spark. Sometimes I think that there's some relationship there between like solo polyamory, being a solo polyamorous person with my Mars and Venus together there. So you can think about what the blend might represent for you of the two. Okay, so there we go. Those are our 5 classical aspects. Again, you want to look at the planets themselves. You want to look at the sign. You want to look at the house. If you notice that you've got multiples, forming interesting patterns. You can look up those aspect patterns. You can see the names of them. I might do a video on this. Let me know below. I've mentioned a lot of topics where I'm like, maybe I'll do a video on this. So if you want a video on something, or if you have a question about your chart and you want to say like a little one-off question, you know, this is happening. Is this a special thing? Ask me and I can make a video about it. And like I said, I'm going to be doing, at the end of this series, I will be doing at least the plan so far, assuming I get volunteers. The plan is to do a kind of pulling it all together video and to include some chart examples. So do you want your chart included in that video? Well, that is actually a special benefit. One of the few, mostly. All of my content's available for free. It's totally optional if you want to support it. If you have found this useful, if you found value and you're able, then I would encourage you to go to Patreon below, and I would love to get a little support from you. This is a way to just keep things flowing and going, and to be able to let folks access it, whatever their level of ability to do so. But also at the sustaining supporter level is the only level that has perks, and they're just to acknowledge that you're really making a contribution at a level that sustains my work. You will find that one of the benefits there is that you get first dibs on a lot of things, and you get to have your chart included in the educational stuff that I produce, whether that's something like this or class, whatever. And so I'm going to be putting that call out to my sustaining supporters to ask who wants their chart used in a video. We can anonymize. We're not going to show the like specifics of the time and the date or your name or anything, but we'll just show the chart itself. And so you're essentially getting like a little free mini reading from me as part of your tier. So if you're interested in that, that's Patreon below. And finally, if you're enjoying this series, you know, leave me a comment if you've got anything that you'd like me to cover, and make sure you're signed up for my newsletter, because I do talk about astrology from time to time, a fair bit on there, and I got some exciting stuff coming, so I would love for you to join my newsletter community and find out about that. Okay, so that's it for this episode of Practical Astrology 101, and we will be back soon with planetary motion.